Having captured the farmers Ganivchuk, Gorshkov, Aparin, and Murashka, the Americans buried them alive because of their links to the local Red partisans. They dealt with the wife of partisan Vaichuk in the following way. They stabbed her body with bayonets and drowned her in a garbage pit. They mutilated the farmer Bochkaryov beyond recognition with bayonets and knives. His nose, lips, and ears were cut off, his jaw was knocked out, his face and eyes were stabbed with bayonets, and his entire body featured multiple stab wounds. At the Svyagino station, they tortured partisan Mysnikov in the same brutal way. According to an eyewitness, first they cut off the ears, then the nose, arms, and legs, cutting them all into pieces while he was still alive. But this isn't a horror movie from some alternative reality about an American invasion of Russia. This is information coming from the acts on tortured and executed peasants in Olginsky district in 1918 through to 1920, housed in the Russian State Archive of the Far East. Russians have understandably been very wary and concerned about invasions from the West because of the historic 19th century Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the subsequent 20th century invasion of Russia by Hitler in the context of World War II with a massive death toll. The expansion of the Cold War relic, NATO, closer and closer toward the Russian borders since the 1990s has been viewed by Russians in this context, understandably so. But the one event that gets sort of forgotten in this context is the 1918 Allied invasion of Russia. Usually in Western sources and even in Russian sources, it is euphemistically referred to as an intervention, air quotes, but of course language is important, so I will be referring to it as it factually was, a betrayal of the highest caliber by the Western Allies and an invasion of Russia starting in January 1918. The former Allies comprised the Czech Legion, who were volunteers in World War I on the side of the Entente, but of course then they started supporting the White Movement, fighting the Bolsheviks. Britain, France, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and several other participants. Now, what's usually not mentioned in this context, but should be because it's part of the broader picture, is the fact that Russians' enemies, opponents in World War I, Germany and Austro-Hungarian forces also attempted to occupy parts of the former Russian Empire. That is basically the Ukrainian territory, Belarus, parts of the Baltic, southern Russia, etc. So both of these, the German participation in the Southwest and the former Allied / Japanese participation all throughout the country in the Far East, in the North, in the South, should be viewed through the same lens as an attempt to loot Russia at best and dismember it for their own purposes at worst. Now, the German situation, of course, took place in part thanks to the newly emergent Soviet government that was fighting for its life. It was fighting for survival, so they signed a devastating Brest-Litovsk Treaty in 1918 in an attempt to gain what they called передышка, basically breathing room from fighting everyone. And as a result, it lost large chunks of the Russian territory. Now, formally, the Triple Entente and friends were officially working with the White Movement, but of course, unofficially, they had their own ulterior motives, and in that context, their treatment of the local Russian population was at times inhuman and quite brutal, as the initial quotation indicates. But First things first. The Russian Revolution, or rather two revolutions of 1917 and a subsequent civil war of approximately 17 to 22 of the 20th century, are complex events, multi-stage events. For the purpose of this video, I will only summarize and highlight certain points because otherwise we're going to be here for hours. Perhaps when this channel is larger, and I intend for it to be so, I can do more of a deep dive. I personally love deep dives done by other people on historic subjects, true crime, etc., etc. So I would love to do one myself, but for now, for the sake of digestibility, we're only going to look at key focal points. So I'm not going to be discussing every white army general fighting the Bolsheviks and every battle, only highlights. So, descent toward the Tsarist government, the monarchy, the autocratic monarchy, became a feature of Russian society from approximately the second half of the 19th century. Now, it ranged from sort of more student intellectual circles in urban environments, Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc., to more violent terrorist action toward the government. The failed revolution of 1905, kind of a dress rehearsal for 1917, was another contributor, and the inability by Nicholas II to really enact substantial reforms to change the social situation, the political situation in Russia were viewed as insufficient. And in fact, his inability to do so exacerbated the overall perception of the Tsarist government. So the conditions in the first decade and into 1917 of the 20th century may be viewed as kind of the perfect storm. Some of them included unresolved issues from the 1861 emancipation of the serfs, so that would involve questions of land accessibility, although some historians do argue that the overall peasant/farmer situation did gradually improve. Socioeconomic inequalities, especially in urban environments, exacerbated by wild capitalism that permeated parts of the Russian society, even though it was generally more agrarian, more than 2/3 agrarian. Specifically, working class militancy actually grew after 1912 in cities, regardless of the Bolshevik participation. It was kind of a separate but related grassroots situation, which of course kind of shows that the revolution had many causes, and there was a lot of social unrest. Many perceived the Tsarist reforms in the wake of 1905, so for instance his work with the State Duma, the parliament, as being too little too late. Some viewed the Tsarist apparatus as repressive altogether. The role of the sort of revolutionary, quasi-revolutionary intelligentsia is probably a little bit overrated, but of course it's also relevant. Now, World War I was a huge factor. It exacerbated all of the above and other conditions. It served as a major watershed and really a tipping point. And then, of course, there was the 1917 revolution in February/March, depending on which calendar you follow, and the Tsar abdicated shortly afterwards, but none of that resolved the overall situation, and that specific revolution was viewed as a failure. Then came the October/November, again, depending on which calendar you follow, revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Bolsheviks were, of course, one of the more politically extreme groups, kind of a minor group, but really dedicated, ideologically and physically dedicated group in Russian society at this time. And so the second revolution came less than a year later after the first revolution that ended up declaring a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky. The Tsar abdicated, but nothing was really resolved. Hence, the second revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks were, of course, seeking to attract a broader base, and what they used was a very simple but ineffective slogan: peace, land, and bread. Now, the extent to which they actually succeeded or failed to carry out these promises is a different story that we'll leave for another time, but this is the kind of sloganeering that they used. Now, this slogan did attract a diverse base, although a small base, and it included workers, soldiers, farmers, slash peasants. But of course, the opposition to the Bolsheviks in the beginning was quite powerful. So, for example, in the spring of 1918, there was a major uprising in, the city of Saratov. And by mid-1918, many historians suggest that the opposition to the Bolsheviks was about 3/4 of Russian society. So, with 3/4 of the Russian society of the former Russian Empire opposing the Bolsheviks, they obviously had quite an uphill battle ahead of them. So, in the meantime, they worked on establishing the Red Army. They obviously realized that they needed definitive military victories beyond gaining popular support, and that military victory was much more important at this time. So, what was the result? The result was an all-out civil war, roughly speaking, between the Reds and the Whites. But that's really kind of a summary and a simple way of looking at it, because in reality it was kind of the war of all against all. You had different political groups represented, different social strata, people with different interests, and of course then you had the foreign invasion that basically sought to benefit themselves rather than the Russian people. So the Reds were the Bolsheviks, or those who supported them or opposed the former imperial government. The Whites were kind of a motley crew of leaders that backed the old imperial government, wanted to gain power themselves, or had other ulterior selfish motives. So, for example, some of them called themselves the, quote, supreme ruler of Russia unilaterally. No one appointed them to have that status. So, while being the direct result of the two revolutions of 1917, we can also say that the Civil War had other causes. So, the inability of all these different groups to really arrive at a compromise, cooperate politically, culturally, socially, or economically. And so each side either chose or was forced to military violent conflict. There was a complete collapse of authority that happened quite fast, and as a result, basic functioning, that basic mechanism of both the state and society collapsed as well. And it's kind of amazing how quickly these things happen. The quote about the thin layer of civilization, quite relevant here. So, the development of ethno-separatist movements, according to some historians, was also another factor of relevance in the context of the revolution and the Russian Civil War of the early 20th century. Now, some Western historians like William Rosenberg argue that even though the Bolsheviks were kind of in the minority, they had an easier time at state building because they're very ideologically and militarily motivated. And he also suggests there was a link between violence of the Civil War and what he called a broad set of hopes that initially rallied the groups that supported a revolution, the workers, the soldiers, the peasants, etc. So, to give you one example of complexity, while Russia's former allies, the treacherous allies, were trying to dismember, or at least root, the former Russian Empire, their adversaries in the Great War that I mentioned earlier, the Germans, essentially controlled, very briefly, a state, air quotes, in the Ukrainian territory in 1918. Now, formally, the state was led by an ex-Imperial Army general, Pavel Skoropadsky, and even for a brief time, he was supported by Pyotr Wrangel, who was another ex-Imperial Army officer, one of the leaders of the White Movement. So, just get this picture. Here's a man who spent, or two men rather, who spent years fighting the Germans, and here they are in a state that is essentially propped up by Germany, even if briefly. So Wrangel kind of realized what the situation was, the extent of the German role. He ended up moving to southern Russia to fight in the Civil War elsewhere. So you can kind of see, diplomatically speaking, how fluid and how problematic these alliances were, especially on the White Army side. Now, overall, civil wars seem to be, in many cases, much worse, much more violent, much bloodier than initially intended. I think we can use the famous quote from World War One, "We'll all be home by Christmas," and obviously that's not what happened. That war ended up delivering a massive, massive death toll in Europe in the tens of millions. And the Russian Civil War was similar. It was definitely not over within a year. It went into the early 1920s, depending on what region you are talking about. Now, the so-called allies, the treacherous allies of the former Russian Empire, already decided in December of 1917 that they were going to, air quotes, intervene. So that is very, very shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. This decision-making process was led by Britain, France, and also had the involvement by the United States. Now, they viewed the white movement as their sort of ticket to establish a level of control in Russia and gain whatever economic and political interests they sought in the context of the Russian Civil War. So officially, of course, these former allies backed the white movement because they claimed they wanted to prevent the spread of the revolutionary movement elsewhere to the rest of Europe and the world. But unofficially, they pursued their own ulterior motives of looting the resource-rich former Russian Empire. So who was going to control what in this absolute madness, this absolute chaos? France salivated at biting chunks out of the Ukrainian territory, Crimea, and Bessarabia, so present-day Moldova. Britain sharpened its claws at biting out chunks of what it called the Cossack territory, as well as the Caucasus, so Georgia, Armenia, etc. The US was briefly neutral, but then it agreed to help Britain and France in this pursuit, and the Americans did two things. First, they viewed the Russian Far East, of course, from an economic perspective. Wow, this place has a ton of natural resources that we can steal. But number two, Japan was their biggest competitor in that region, and Japan had exactly the same goal. So the Americans wanted to push Japan out of the Russian Far East and basically benefit themselves more. Of course, it should be mentioned that in the early 20th century, the US was much, much, much more wary of getting involved in foreign conflicts as opposed to today, both in terms of popular public opinion and political opinion. So World War I obviously is a great example. The US didn't get involved in that conflict until 1917, but relatively is an operating word here. After all, the 1904 Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine allowed, air quotes, the US to intervene in Central and South America, including militarily, because the US viewed that area as its own backyard. Now, Eurasia was a bit of a different animal in this context. Even though this adventurism was kind of looked down upon at the time in the early 20th century, that doesn't mean that there were not very, very ardent supporters of invading Russia. So, for example, Republican Senator Miles Poindexter was one of the leading voices of aggressively advocating for the invasion of Russia. Likewise, David French, who was the last US ambassador to pre-revolutionary Russia, advocated the same. He wanted to gain control over the Russian Far East, and he also felt very generous, so he said, you know what, we're going to control the Russian Far East, but our friends, Britain, they can control Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, so in the north, on the other side of the continent, because, very generous of him to give out someone else's land. So you guys thought it might have only been the, doofus Michael McPhail, let's call him that, meddling in the Russian affairs and engaging in questionable pursuits in the 21st century as the US ambassador to Russia. But clearly it started much earlier, in my opinion, allegedly. Thus, as the Soviet government signed the humiliating Brest-Litovsk Treaty in the spring of 1918 with their opponents in World War I, Russia's treacherous allies also jumped into action. So you kind of had this lovely backstabbing going on from the Allies, while Russia willingly, begrudgingly gave up land in the West. So what happened? Well, the French and the British landed in Murmansk in the northwest of the Eurasian continent in March, while the Japanese did the same in the Russian Far East, and they landed in Vladivostok in the next month. The U.S. War Department tasked General William Graves with sending the 27th and the 31st infantry regiments, as well as the 13th and 62nd regiments, who were volunteers, to Vladivostok in August of 1918. Up to 8,000 U.S. expeditionary forces that also featured participation by Canadians, Brits, and Italians landed in the Far East that same month. In December of 1918, the British and the French also landed in the former Russian Empire's southwest, so Sevastopol, Crimea, Odessa, Nikolaev, Novorossiysk, Kherson, and Batumi. So this is current present-day southern Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia. The Western quote-unquote liberators of Russia and Japan fully took advantage of Russia's natural resources. So in the Far East, for example, they went after gold and timber and fur. On top of that, the Alexander Kolchak, one of the white leaders, government, quote-unquote air quotes, permitted American companies to carry out trading operations in exchange for loans from such financial institutions as Citibank. Obviously, that particular institution didn't seem to be concerned as to the legitimacy of that very briefly functioning so-called government. Now, as an example, one company alone exported 15.7 thousand pounds of wool, 20,500 sheepskins, and 10.2 thousand large dry skins from Vladivostok to the United States as quickly as they could. In other words, the so-called Allies exported anything and everything they could get their hands on as quickly as they could. Of course, the so-called Allies may have looted Russia successfully for a time, but they lost their men too. So, for example, Americans lost approximately 200 soldiers and officers in combat in Russia. Did you guys know that? Now, according to Boris Yulin, who is a Russian military historian, the Western invaders, in my opinion, primary interest in Russia was, of course, economic. Quote, gold mines, timber, and coal, they planned to get it all. I am convinced that the Russian Civil War was so long and bloody only because of the intervention by these foreign powers. If it were not for the Czechs supporting the whites and the interventionists, it would have already ended without much bloodshed in 1918. The leaders of the white movement secured American, English, French, and Japanese concessions and promised to pay off the Tsar's debts. In reality, they handed foreigners the control over the Russian territory, end quote. So, as the so-called liberators of Russia got their hands on anything and everything they could in Russia, they also at times treated the local Russian population in an absolutely inhuman way. Whenever they suspected them for cooperating with the guerrilla or the partisan movements that would have been supporting the Reds. So they didn't even have any proof of that. So according to historian Fyodor Nesterov, quote, the supporters of the Soviets, wherever the bayonet of the overseas quote-unquote Russia's liberators could reach, were stabbed, chopped up, shot in groups, hanged, drowned in the Amur River, taken away in torture, quote-unquote death trains, and starved to death in concentration camps, end quote. Sounds absolutely insane. It actually kind of gives you the taste of other Western interventions that happened later in the 20th century and beyond. Now, of course, this is a civil war. There is violence on both sides, but these are foreigners we're talking about who are not really benefiting the Russian population. They're benefiting themselves financially. So it's a little bit different, even though we can make, negative comments about the violence of civil war on each of the two sides. Nesterov suggests that the inhuman treatment of locals by these foreign invaders was actually one of the contributing factors of changing their minds, or some of their minds, about the Bolsheviks, whereas initially they were opposed to the new Soviet self-proclaimed government, they actually started supporting them. And the guerrilla movement in the context of the Civil War supporting the Reds was actually at times successful, to the point where some of the groups ended up linking up with the official Red Army. By early 1919, the French failed in their Black Sea offensive, and the French troops were growing unhappy. I mean, is that really surprising? They've been slaughtered at the front since 1914. France lost an immense number of men in the context of World War I, and civilians, of course. And here they are being sent to Russia after the initial conflict, right? World War I was officially completed in late 1918, and here they are in Russia in 1919 participating in this strange adventurism. Of course they're growing unhappy, to the point that there was revolutionary sentiment amongst the French troops, so much so that their commanders were actually forced to pull them out. In the next few months and until August of that same year, 1919, Russia's treacherous allies continued to evacuate their troops from different parts of the former Russian Empire. So Central Asia, Baku in Azerbaijan, Crimea in the south of the Ukrainian territory. So by early 1920s, Russia's former allies were forced to completely withdraw. Bye, Felicia. Meanwhile, even though the circumstances looked bleak for the Reds, starting, initially when most people opposed them, they actually were quite successful at the front, eventually winning militarily first in the Volga, in the Urals, in the fall of 1918, as Germany, of course, was one of the losers of World War I. The Soviets were able to retake the land that they lost in the context of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So as a result, in about a year, the Bolsheviks went from controlling essentially central parts of Russia to reclaiming several other parts of the former Russian Empire. In December of 1918, the Red Army stopped the offensive by Alexander Kolchak in the area of Ufa. Kolchak, a former admiral, was the self-described supreme ruler of Russia. I told you this was a complicated conflict, didn't I? In 1919, the Red Army continued to make headway on various fronts. So, for example, it defeated Anton Denikin, another white leader who called himself an acting supreme ruler of the Russian state. So a little bit lower than Kolchak, right? And this occurred in the Voronezh and Orel region, the two cities. Another white movement leader, Nikolai Yudenich's troops were beaten outside of Petrograd, which used to be St. Petersburg, but did not quite yet become Leningrad, the city of many names. And in 1920, the Reds pushed Wrangel, the former collaborator, right, of the German pseudo-state in the Ukrainian territory. He was kicked out of Crimea. So, after the Soviet government was militarily successful, it implemented a temporary new economic policy between 1921 and 1928. This was, of course, part of their state building, but really part of survival, because they were still fighting for their life as a new state in a hostile environment, both having to gain the popular support of the population and also dealing with hostilities all around this, what eventually became the Soviet Union, rather. So the new economic policy was a departure from the socialist/communist state control. It allowed for partial private ownership in non-essential industries. But the reason I'm mentioning this is the fact that the same country that had invaded Russia a couple of years prior never apologized to it. Not holding my breath for that. They actually ended up gaining concessions and now officially participated in the Russian industries and gained access to Russia's natural resources as part of this new economic policy. Now, the next time that the West would have access to Russia's natural resources and the ability to loot Russia again happened in the 1990s. Because it's so historically recent, many Russians remember the neoliberal nightmare of the 1990s, and they This is why they're wary of certain plans by the current Western establishment, and they can see past some of the previous slogans. Of course, more recently, the Western establishment has been much more blunt regarding their plans. But in this context, the 1918 Allied invasion of Russia kind of gets lost, and I find it important. I think it teaches a really important lesson as to what could happen, and it's a lesson that should be remembered. That's all I have for you guys. This investigation took a little bit longer than I anticipated because of having to do additional research. I hope you found it worthwhile. It's not a subject that is commonly discussed today, even though it's quite relevant. Thank you for supporting me. Thank you for supporting this channel. I intend for it to grow so we can release more videos on a more regular basis. Please do all the things on YouTube to make sure that the algorithm picks me up, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.